I'm a specialist in medieval literary and intellectual culture. Ooh. Ooh. When I was at York, my MA dissertation was on body rhetoric in monastic ghost stories, which is a fancy way of saying I did my master's on medieval zombies. Really, really fun, honestly. But the intersection of literary, religious, and medical history is kind of where my interest lies. Right now, I work with the rest of the team at St. Leonard's, not St. Leonard's, at the museum, and we're working on writing of history of St. Leonard's and looking at the history of medieval Bamford, sort of in context, because this is the one medieval building that we have in the area. And actually, show of hands, if you knew about it before this evening, or before hearing about this talk, hands up. Most of you. If you knew anything about it besides the name. Good, nice. Anyway, before we talk about medieval leprosy though, I thought I'd kind of ease us in. And before we talk about what medieval people think of leprosy, what do you think about when you think about leprosy? Is it maybe something like this? This is oh dear, the quality's not fantastic, but this is a picture from 1912. It's part of a series that were commissioned for a museum, and it's intended to show a medieval leper. And it's a sort of sad, sorry little scene, really. You can see all the townspeople up here fleeing up the steps, and you can tell that really it's supposed to be a scene of discord and disaster because they've left the little baby behind, which is a tiny little figure on the edge of that sort of shadow mass on the left. Otherwise, leprosy, maybe you've seen Ben-Hur. Leprosy pops up a lot in pop culture. These are just 4 examples that I could think of off the top of my head. Ben-Hur, you may remember, Judah's mother and sisters live in the Valley of the Lepers, and their life is presented as a kind of living death. And then at the end of the film, they're healed by a miracle. Yay. Damien the Leper Priest is a semi-historically accurate biography. I only wanted to call your attention to it for the tagline. He risked his life to save society's most terrifying outcasts. Society's most terrifying outcasts? That's strong language. Kingdom of Heaven, which you may or may not have seen, presents a dubiously historically accurate picture of King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, who's famously a leper. And this is news to me. King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem has lately been adopted by, how do I put it kindly? A very particular kind of very online teenage guy who's really into stoicism as a kind of stoic hero. I mean, cool, but I don't get it. And finally, Princess Mononoke, which I think is the most, the kindest representation out of all of these, is a Japanese film in which the setting has a iron foundry, and the matriarch of the iron foundry takes in all these lepers, and in exchange for care and bed and board, they make weapons for her, which is, I think, quite an astute portrayal of the way that one might have to sell one's morals, or sell oneself in some sense in order to afford care. So, many ideas floating around about what leprosy is, how we view it. But what is it, medically speaking? This is the slide with the illustration on it. You have them warned. So, through a medical lens, leprosy is a bacterial infection that's related to tuberculosis. And today we know it's Hansen's disease, after the scientist who discovered it with a microscope, gave it its name. It's chronic, it's progressive. In the medieval period there was no cure, but it's notable because it has a variety of milder and more severe presentations, and it can mimic other diseases. So even today it remains quite difficult, first to identify and second to treat. But for our purposes, it's endemic in Europe between the 11th and the 14th century. So for 300 years, it's a fairly major problem for people. The important part to remember really is that it's very communicable, but it rarely successfully infects people. In fact, today people estimate that maybe 95% of the population has a so-called natural immunity to leprosy. The symptoms can be very visually striking. I hope that this image is somewhat self-explanatory, but for a little more detail, it primarily affects the nerves, the skin, and the eyes and the face, but particularly the extremities. It can cause insensitivity to pain or touch. And in later stages, it affects the bones and soft tissue of the face and gives it a distinctive leonine look, which is the kind of hallmark of late-stage leprosy. Otherwise, it may damage vocal cords, it may cause blindness, and a sufferer with leprosy may lose the use of their hands or feet. For the individual, this may mean that they have to stop working, or they have to reduce the amount that they work. They may need help getting around or be confined to one location. They may look different, their voice may sound different, or they may lose the ability to speak. And they may experience a change in the way that in their identity, in the way that other people relate to them, and in the way that they relate to themselves. Because your face is how people know you, generally. And any disease which creates major changes to the way you look will have implications for your identity. Importantly also, it poses a greater risk to immunocompromised populations. You're more likely to get it if your immune system isn't working very well due to prior infection, or notably for the medieval period, having experienced famine. And this is a reality for many people in the high Middle Ages, because life is simply more precarious. So a large kind of swathe of the population is susceptible to leprosy at this time. A moment. So that's the kind of medical view. If you went to Sunday school, you might remember this. So in the book of Leviticus in the Old Testament, this is important because this informs how many people think about leprosy. The book of Leviticus has this to say. There's an absolutely exhaustive list of ways that you can diagnose leprosy in Leviticus 13, and it ends with this. So the expectation on people who have leprosy is that his clothes shall be torn and his head bare, so you make yourself conspicuous, and he shall cry, unclean, unclean. You draw attention to yourself and your difference, and you live outside the camp, without the camp. So you do not live with other people. Interestingly, I didn't include this, but Leviticus also tells you how to identify leprosy in fabrics. So pieces of cloth and tents can get leprosy. It's not necessarily a medical view, it's more of a big symbol for contagion, broadly defined. And that's important, hang on to that, because this informs the medieval attitude much later. However, if you look at the New Testament, Luke is quite different. This is Luke 12 through 14. I've used New King James for this, so if you want to look it up later, New King James. In the New Testament, we have accounts of Christ healing a leper who finds him in the street. And he put forth his hand and touched him, saying, I will be thou clean. So the emphasis here, all that, the idea of segregation, of corruption and defilement, and the idea that lepers must be apart from other people forever is gone. It's Christ going to touching the untouchable. And increasingly, as the 11th, 12th century winds on, it's this New Testament idea of bringing lepers into the fold and back into the church that informs how people are reacting to people with leprosy. Oh, I should mention also, I forgot to earlier, I should defend my use of language that might seem fairly stigmatizing. Although we would now call leprosy Hansen's disease, in the medieval period, they've never heard of Hansen and his microscope. So, hasn't been invented yet. And they rely purely on what something looks like. So not only do people with Hansen's disease get called lepers, people with any kind of nasty looking skin disease, or, something that looks like leprosy is leprosy. So people with psoriasis or psoriatic arthritis, that kind of thing, are also called lepers. It's a kind of a broad church, if you will. And although medieval people are aware of the way in which language can be stigmatizing, they do still refer to people suffering from leprosy as lepers, not necessarily pejoratively. That's why I'm using it. Let us carry on. So, if you live in England and you have leprosy in the 11th, 12th century, how do you find out about that? It varies across the continent. In some places you're more likely to see a doctor. In England, probably not. Here you might be examined by a priest, or maybe somebody from the sort of local town authority, so maybe a bailiff. Oh, I've lost my place in my notes. And after that, conventional wisdom says that lepers were stripped of their property and their legal status and ejected from town. However, in reality it's more complicated. People have more control over what happens to them, and outcomes tend to be stratified by social class. So thinking back to Balban of Jerusalem, he contracted leprosy as a child, and he remained king of Jerusalem. He got to do the things that kings do, and learn how to ride a horse, and command armies and this kind of thing. And he wasn't sequestered. But then again, kings have more resources to hide their condition from others, and also to seek medical care. Among other social classes, people who could continue working usually did, and there's accounts of people living in towns and frequently consulting a doctor to kind of manage their condition without having to be segregated. That said, when diagnosis has a very heavy social toll, where you might be ejected from your home, people do go out of their way to avoid it, quite obviously. Crucially, nothing materially changes about a person when they are diagnosed with leprosy. Say I have leprosy and I don't know it. Somebody telling me that I have leprosy does not change anything about me, but it suddenly shunts me into a very different societal role, and suddenly it's okay to strip me of my possessions, even though either side of that moment in time nothing changes. But a diagnosis of leprosy puts all those beliefs about contagion and segregation onto the sufferer without their consent, so it can be quite a violent act. This isn't the case in England, but in France, heretics were sometimes branded as lepers just so they could be pushed to the sidelines a little. Anyway, where am I? And that's fairly important to remember. Leprosy is not a diagnosis necessarily, but it also implies a societal role as much as being a medical condition. So, if you were diagnosed with leprosy, you had several options. You could try and conceal it and continue to live your life. You could join a monastic order, sometimes without a fee, so pro deo for lepers. Not fantastically popular, because not everybody who contracts leprosy wants to become a monk. I feel like it, it needs to be said. Although you do get frequent accounts of people joining monasteries because they've been diagnosed with leprosy. It's a way of retreating from the world. Or, if that wasn't for you, you could join a hospital. And, which leads us quite nicely into, well, what's a medieval hospital? I'm just going to let that go, I think. So a word about this woodcut first. This is much later than our period, really. It's from the Hôtel Dieu in Paris. And It's a woodcut from the 16th century, I think. However, it's one of the very few images that we have of the inside of a medieval hospital. And I don't know if I have a little... Can I use my mouse? Yeah. It's probably completely impossible to see. One moment. Sorry, this is very unprofessional of me. Laser pointer, yes. Okay. So, we have a sort of undifferentiated space. It's divided up by these two columns, sort of. But there's an altar at one end with a depiction of the crucifixion here. There are the sick being tended to by sisters of the house. And here as well is the king praying. And two sisters sewing shrouds. So, the important thing to know about medieval hospitals is that they're equally for the cure of souls as much as the cure of bodies. And when you're thinking about leprosy, which at this time has no cure, that's quite important. One moment. Most founders of hospitals, in fact, include a charter on how the inhabitants should live, and most of them are modelled after the religious life. So in some places people wear a habit or an outfit which is kind of modelled on a monk's habit, and they mark the hours of the day with certain prayers. They're also expected to live chastely, so if you're married, you swear to sort of live apart from your spouse. But it's kind of religious life light. It's not quite as severe as joining a monastery, and in hospitals people can come and go. You're not sworn to it for life. People sometimes live in a hospital for a few years and move away again and do all sorts. They also range in size from very, very big to very, very little, like we have here in Blandford. So St Leonard's would have been a very small house, but the hospital quarter in York is maybe the better part of half an acre. And it's attached to the Abbey of St Mary's, so it's better documented and it had more money. Larger hospitals tend to be better endowed, so they either are attached to a religious house or they have big wealthy patrons. But smaller institutions like St Leonard's either have a few poorer patrons or no patrons at all, and instead they rely on alms from the local community. Hospitals also need staff, who would live a sort of semi-religious life alongside those they served. Large hospitals, of course, more staff, small hospitals, less, and they also have a priest. In St Leonard's, tracking down that priest has been somewhat difficult. They also need regular staff to do laundry, housekeeping, and there's good evidence that hospitals could provide employment and care for different members of the same family. So in France, there's a record of a man going to live in a hospital as a patient, and in the same hospital his mother worked in the same hospital and did the laundry. So this whole family has employment and care from the same institution. In terms of what hospital life was like, the emphasis was on cleanliness, wholesome food, clothes were washed twice a week, people were provided with a varied diet to the extent that the circumstances allowed, and quite often hospitals have their own gardens, so they can grow their own food, and patients contribute to the garden as their condition allows. For leprosy, although there's no cure, being able to stay clean and to have one's bandages changed often does quite a lot for prolonging life. And also, unlike what you might think, most lepers were not shut up in their hospitals and could visit their friends and family or keep in touch with them via other means at least. And now I've been talking nearly 20 minutes, so let's actually talk about St Leonard's, shall we? So this is the place. I've got the old 1902 OS map up for you. I'm going to get the laser pointer back. Where is it? Not that one. So this long building here is St. Leonard's Chapel, and this is the farmhouse. This is St. Leonard's Avenue, it runs up the hill, and then down towards town and up towards the bypass, kind of. I wanted this one rather than a current map because it shows you the footprint of the building, which is substantially reduced now. This photo here is the northern aspect, and then this is kind of southeast. So that's the east window. The door is behind this big bush, and there's a window here, and a door been punched through here at some point. So love that. So, I've said about the footprint. Another important thing to note is that the Pimpern Brook runs along the back of the building. More on that later. But this is very handy if you have a hospital where there are lepers, because they're forbidden from bathing in the same rivers as other people, or at least within proximity of other people. And it's handy if the brook is within 3 feet of your back door. It's been culverted now. There's a big hump in the ground, you can see it. Since it's a hospital, we can probably assume that the building that survives today was the chapel. And it would be typical for a hospital of this size to be a chapel surrounded by smaller cottages or outbuildings in which people lived. I can't speak to the archaeological evidence for that because I don't know if any work's ever been done there. It's been rather difficult to track down, but if it is indeed a hospital like we think it is, that is what you would expect. Additionally, they may have had their own graveyard, but again, history don't relate. I did have a look in Hutchins for this. If you were here last month, you will know that Reverend John Hutchins was a county historian who wrote a very thorough history of the county in 1774. Here is the full account of St. Leonard's. Here was a chapel dedicated to St. Leonard, a little east from Damery House, long since desecrated, of which we have no other account. That's it. However, work by other historians, namely former curator of the museum Benjamin Cox and Michael Barr, has established the following timeline, more or less. I apologise for how wordy this is. If you want a better version of this, please look at the documents very kindly provided by the Civic Society, because they do a better job than I do. But we think that the chapel was active between 1282, which is at least the first documentary evidence, it may be older, and it probably ceased to be a hospital around the time of the Reformation, for fairly obvious reasons. In that time, it passes into and out of the possession of the Abbey of Fontevraud. It may have been founded by the Abbey of Fontevraud. Of course, sorry, hang on. On this one, I've simply said accounts vary because I'm having some trouble tracking down exactly when it was founded and by whom and who the land belonged to. It's either the Earls of Leicester or Gloucester. There's a lot of marriages and everybody's called Robert de Beaumont. I'm very scared. More on this to follow. If I find anything, I'll do another talk. So that's that. The important things to note are it probably continued as a chapel, hospital, maybe almshouses until about the mid-1500s. After that, some almshouses were built in the centre of town, and that probably meant that it fell out of use. It was then used as a chapel of ease, meaning a smaller chapel so people don't have to travel so far to go to the chapel. And the last recorded baptism there was in 1760, which was triplets and John and James Pastic. After that, it sees mixed use as a barn. I think that drawing is by R.C. Perry from either 1902 or around that time. And then before the demolition of the extensions, it looked like this. So this is roughly the footprint of the building today, and all this is gone. The window is in that wall, so it was extended to the east as well. And then I said about the Pimpern Brook, it used to be all the way down behind the building. Of course, famously, St. Leonard's Chapel was renovated in 1996 when they put those big brick buttresses on, which everybody loved and was super chill about. I mean, I'm kidding. I do love this article for how willingly misleading it is. But yes. I don't think they've mellowed out as much as English Heritage hoped they would. Today it's the office for the county rangers. I haven't included a photo of the inside because I didn't want to show you a photo of their office without telling them. It felt kind of rude. However, if you go along and knock, you may be allowed in to have a little look. They're nice, they don't bite. So that brings us up to now. And to be honest, the amount of history we know about St. Leonard's is little, but I thought I'd compare it with another local institution which survives a bit better, which is St. Margaret and St. Anthony's in Wimbledon. You may or may not know about this. It's on the road into town, kind of. And it's another little, smaller religious institution which was probably the same kind of footprint and usage as St. Leonard's. It's a small, undifferentiated, long building, probably used as a chapel. And it was surrounded, we know this, by several almshouses or little cottages. And again, this is believed to have been used as a leper house. Hutchins has more to say about this. I've printed off a page. In fact, there's a whole page. At the west end of the town stands a hospital, a very ancient foundation. In a chest in the chapel of the hospital is a deed that shows that there was no endowment, but that the poor were maintained by alms. That's quite significant, because it means that for whoever lived there, there was no money but what they could bring in. So the lepers of St. Margaret and St. Anthony's have to beg for alms. They have license to beg, but they are reliant on the charity of the local community. There's a good quote in here somewhere. I did want to read straight from this, but I have to find my line. At the beginning of a book of accounts relating to this hospital, and still preserved in it, it is said to be of the erection of maybe John of Gaunt. There's some discussion about this in the footnote. It might be John of Gaunt, we don't know. Sometime Duke of Aquitaine and Lancaster, to which duchy the manor of Kingston Lacy belonged, but there is no account what number of poor were here maintained. You've heard the thing about the chest. And then, to the which there is neither lands nor goods to maintain it, but only the charitable alms of the people. So, St. Margaret and St. Anthony's would have been quite a poor house, probably. I think the reason that it survived and that we know about it is because it has some association with the Minster, which probably keeps the records. However, one thing we do know, since it was restored in the 19th century, is that it was once painted on the inside. Unfortunately, that 19th century restoration has destroyed those paintings. But if you want to see something similar, you should go to Wimborne Minster. I'll let you just kind of have a picture hasn't come up fantastically. It's not so bad, I'll just describe. This section of wall shows several scenes. So there's a figure here, and there's a figure here. This is the crucifixion, and another figure here, and then this embellishment. Probably the most legible figure is the crucifixion, depicted in a very 12th century style. The cross has little sprouting sort of bits on it like a tree, and Christ is looking very bloody and tormented, which is of the 12th century kind of fashion. Oh, I've lost my page in my notes. I'll let you look at this while I find my page. Alright. I think I've got it. Not. There we go, okay. So, it can be kind of difficult to recover, well, wrong thing. We talked about lepers as sort of social pariahs and the, idea that they are meant to live apart due to their condition. However, in the 12th century, considering that leprosy is quite a sort of visible issue, there's changes in the ways that people see lepers and respond to them, and part of this comes from saints' lives and kind of currents in the church and their attitude to leprosy. Saints like St. Francis of Assisi and Nevesta de Huy in the Netherlands, I think, conspicuously go out of their way to aid lepers, and there's a few miracle stories and things in which noble men and women imitate Christ, and they do things like kissing lepers, being very conspicuous about their service of them in a way that's kind of self-abasing. And this kind of bleeds out into the culture and means that lepers are kind of understood as being uniquely close to God, and service of them, therefore, is especially holy. My apologies. This is the classic kind of textual example of this, is one of the canons of the Third Lateran Council in 1179. So I'm going to read through this, and then I'm going to bring your attention back to the way that this shows 12th century attitudes to leprosy changing. It reads, "Although the apostle says we should pay greater honour to our weaker members, certain ecclesiastics, seeking what is their own and not the things of Jesus Christ, do not allow lepers who cannot dwell with the healthy or come to church with others to have their own churches and cemeteries or to be helped by the ministry of their own priests. Since it is recognised that this is far from Christian piety, we decree in accordance with apostolic charity that wherever so many are gathered together under a common way of life, they are able to establish a church for themselves with a cemetery and rejoice in their own priest, they should be allowed to have them without contradiction. Let them take care, however, not to harm in any way the parochial rights of established churches. For we do not wish that what is granted to them on the score of piety should result in harm to others. We also declare that they should not be compelled to pay tithes for their gardens or the pasture of animals." So this is a document that comes out of the church's decrees on how certain things should be dealt with in the church, and it's fundamentally kind of, what's the word? Aspirational. But it lays out guidelines for how to deal with lepers. And note that it mentions apostolic charity twice, and nowhere does it call back to the Levitican idea of separation, segregation, and kind of shame. It also is not saying where there are lepers, we cast them out. It is saying, wherever so many are already gathered together under a common way of life, that they've already established a church for themselves. We should allow that. It's like the book of Luke, it's bringing them back into the fold. By the way, I can't take credit for this interpretation. This is really riffing off the work of my supervisor, Sathina Watson. Either way, so it grants certain rights, that they should not be compelled to pay tithes, that they should be able to have a church and their own priest, but also grants the condition of they should not harm the parochial rights of established churches. And this, I argue, and so does my supervisor, sets out the legal precedent for hospitals, which are kind of rather legally strange, because they're so diverse. They can be founded by one person or by a religious house. But this is the kind of ideal of apostolic charity that they're appealing to. Which brings us nearly to the end. We're nearly there, promise. Ooh. Further evidence for the use of St. Leonard's as a hospital is these. These are pilgrim relics. The three on the left are in our museum. You can come and look at them. You should come and look at them. And they are punched out of tin. They're holy water ampullae. They carry a little drop of holy water from your pilgrimage, wherever that may be. These ones are shell-shaped, so they're probably from Santiago de Compostela in Spain. This pilgrim site is one of the ones that you might go to if you had leprosy, so it's possible that these were brought back by somebody with leprosy or one of their friends or relations for them to have and to bring them spiritual comfort. You can string a little string through the holes and wear it, or you can keep it on you, that kind of thing. It's a very tactile little object of devotion, if you will. So we're nearly at the end. We've got lepers, we've got hospitals which are either supported by the community, by wealthy patrons, by a little bit of both. We have all these relics being exchanged and stuff. And a kind of legal framework for how a hospital might function socially. It remains only for me to sort of sum this up with how this all fits together. And since there's money changing hands, there's land and people, you can arguably talk about leprosy in hospitals in terms of a spiritual economy. Only, you're not only passing cash around, there's also sort of spiritual benefits. So hospital founders might hope to receive prayers for the health of their soul, but they also take on responsibility for the hospital as a whole. Lepers can receive lodging and care, spiritual comfort, but you might also have to modify your way of life and the way that you dress and go live in a different place. And you have to submit to, whether you think of it as an indignity or not, you have to submit to being cared for by others. Additionally, the community might see some relief for urban poverty from having a hospital. They might also provide employment and prayer, but they also have charitable responsibility towards the hospital and its grounds. So all of these sort of moving pieces together make a system in which not just money, but care and spiritual kind of capital is all exchanged. Anyway, I hate to end this rather abruptly, but to sum up, lepers during this period occupy a fairly perilous position in terms of being reviled and venerated for their special closeness to God, if you will. And their lives are often defined by social and financial precarity. In terms of institutional history, St. Leonard's was quite small. It may have been quite poor, but it was probably active for quite a long time. Currently, the research group is chasing up documentary evidence for the 13th through 14th centuries, looking through wills, things of this nature. But again, work in progress. And other than that, there is much more work for us to do about the history of medieval Bamford as a whole. That's all. Thank you very much. Yeah, of course. I've got time for questions, please.
I heard when I first came here 25 years ago, and I went to see the chapel. I heard that the end of it that was knocked off when they were building the homes over there, and the builders applied for permission to remove part of the chapel to increase the garden, a particular garden they wanted to be bigger. And they were told no, and then they had a bulldozer accident. I wonder if that has any basis in reality.
Unfortunately, I can't speak to the truth of that, but it isn't uncommon. I will say that much.
Is that St. Leonard you're talking about?
Yeah, you'd likely know the
Well,
answer.
you know that Stuart's garden next door
Yes.
is built of stones from the chapel.
Yes, yeah, I knew that, but what I heard was that the builders, when they were building that whole area there, the house builders, thought that this one needed a certain sized garden and had asked for permission to remove a portion of the building. We're told no, and then had a bulldozer accident to make sure that they got the portion away.
Unlike the Danbury burial ground, where they stopped digging.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think we have a photo. So we live in St. Leonard's farmhouse, and I think we have a photo of that. Stuart has many photos.
Yeah. Well, he got those from the museum. He actually came and we went through and picked
Well,
them
I'm
all
sure
out.
he's got one that's got the picture of the
It's got a picture of the original, yeah. Yeah. But just how it got removed was sort of interesting. I had a question about the hospitals.
Sure.
When they had these leper hospitals, were the leper hospitals separate from the general hospital population?
Depends where you are. Usually, yes. For where I used to live, I used to live on Lawrence Street in York, and York has its own very large hospital complex near the Minster, and one smaller leper hospital called St. Nicholas. Actually, I nearly took a flat in St. Nicholas Gardens, which is where it was when I was younger. But it's a much smaller institution. I think at most there were 13 brothers and sisters there. So leper hospitals do tend to be smaller, and one thing that I forgot to mention is that they tend to arise according to a particular need, and when that need passes, they disappear again. So they're quite ephemeral, records-wise too, which is what we're finding here.
Is the prevalence of leprosy related in any way, I can't see why it would be, but I can imagine that it might be, to the Crusades? And the movement of people?
Yes and no. There's jury's still out about this one, really. It's thought by some that the Crusades bring leprosy to Europe, but actually the Anglo-Roman cemetery in Dorchester is one of the first places in the UK that has evidence of leprosy, and that's in the Roman period. So it's been here a long time. What exactly about the 11th century that kicks it all up again is unclear.
You reminded me when I launched that I'd heard, and I have no idea how true this is, I meant to look it up before coming but didn't. I've heard that in Roman times Portland was actually a leper colony.
Oh, right. Yes, I've heard that too. I don't know a whole lot about it. My scope is rather more medieval, but I believe that it was. Yes, at the back.
You mentioned that some of these hospitals have dedicated graveyards. Is there any evidence that the graves
Again, we don't know a whole lot about the environment that St. Leonard's Chapel sits in. I don't know that there's ever been a concerted archaeological effort to dig there. Unfortunately, I can't tell you very much. I would love to know, but whether or not they had their own churchyard is currently one of the things that we're trying to find out.
My guess is the construction of the homes there, and you would probably know this better than I would, that the construction of that set of houses predated the requirement to do archaeological surveys. And it would have been great to have an archaeological survey there.
Yeah, and
Could we
the
get
other,
Stuart to let us dig up the garden?
but the other thing is, do you think the bit that is remaining is the bit furthest away from Plymouth Brook, and that the rest of it was in a square beyond it?
Oh,
You know what I mean?
Yes,
Plymouth
yes.
Brook presumably is where the footpath is.
yes, the footpath goes over it.
So the
Yes,
reason-
yes.
Yes. And so you've got the fence, and then you've got a grass area, and then you've got what's left of the chapel.
Yes.
So do you think the rest of it was in that grass area? Does anybody know?
I don't.
Looking at that early map that you had, where it shows the square.
Yes, those are the St Leonard's farmhouse buildings, I believe. So
Do you
I
know?
think.
Well, that bit of grass you're talking about is actually the culvert. If you look at our garden, that's the section that is the culvert.
Oh, right,
that
is it?
runs.
So it
it's
goes
not
under your
just-
garden? No,
The
it goes up.
culvert runs
sorry,
in
it
our
goes under
garden.
Stuart's garden.
The path is the other side of the
It's
culvert.
about 10
Yeah.
feet from the path.
So the path is the other side of it.
Oh, right,
So
so the
when
rest,
we were
the rest of
renovating
the chapel must have been beyond the bit
I
that's
think
left.
it's this way towards us.
Yeah.
So the chapel came along.
One
towards
second,
the back of
I'll
us,
grab a map again.
and then was forward
Yeah,
where Stuart's house is.
yes.
Okay, there's a
Yeah.
photo.
So that's where we need to
Yeah,
dig.
that's
The brook runs along.
Stuart's and we're not. We dug everything in ours. There's nothing there.
Yeah.
Here you go. The brook runs along this side here. So here's the present building. So I would, purely on practical reasons, I think that it was probably the south side that had buildings.
Yeah.
So it makes sense because they would have been
Yeah.
sunny too.
Yeah.
Because there was only that much space in those photos, really, from the back of the chapel to where the brook is. It's very limited.
Yes, indeed. All right. Question at the back there. You.
I'm interested about so more of the social. So you said around the end of the 14th century. After before that they were seen as sort of more unholy and sort of more dirty by the church. Then it was after the saints started going Kevin. I'm very interested in this switch. I've actually got my question is basically were there other forces as well as just the saints started doing it, or was it also because I was thinking about either physical or even the idea of suffering, suffering being like holy or something, right? The idea of that suffering all the time could be another reason why there's
Indeed.
I'm sure some more forces.
I can sort of fling a few at you. On the one hand, I really should have mentioned this. Many people see or saw illness sometimes as escaping time in purgatory after death. So if you're very ill during your life, you don't have to go to purgatory and get burned with flames and bitten by dogs and things. You can go more quickly on to heaven. And since lepers are seen as very sick, they're understood as having skipped purgatory, and they'll go straight to heaven when they die. Which is why their prayers are quote unquote worth more. And people are very interested, at least in the late sort of 12th century, 13th century, of associated being closer to them, serving them as you might serve Christ, essentially. Does that answer your question?
It is very interesting.
Any more? Yep.
What was the lifespan if you're a leper living? Was it reduced significantly, or was it?
It really, really depends.
I guess.
It depends how severe your version of the disease was. It depends how fast it progressed.
Social status?
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Keep harping on about Baldwin IV. He contracted leprosy as a child. No one's really sure how, but he lived until the age of 24, and when he died of a secondary infection. So you could live quite a long time with leprosy, and especially if you had a milder case. It wasn't like plague. It wasn't immediately kind of deadly. It was a disease that was marked by prolonged disability rather than extremely high mortality.
You mentioned
because identifying what is leprosy and how you quantify that is quite difficult.
Because I was just wondering about the upswing in the 12th century and how much that appertained to the really bad weather and the civil war that was going on.
Yeah,
At
I
the
mean,
time was Stephen and Matilda and
definitely, yeah. Any period that produces prolonged stress will produce an immunocompromised population, which is then more susceptible to leprosy. And so I suppose when it comes back from the Crusades then, people are not particularly well primed to resist it. But I must confess, my sort of wheelhouse is more social responses to leprosy.
I'm just going to say, I think that determining the distribution of the disease in the past, and it's difficult in the present day. You're all familiar with the idea that if you drink a glass of red wine a day, you're going to be healthier. Well, that came out of looking at cardiac problems across Europe. But it was many years later when somebody pointed out the way in which a doctor describes a cardiac disease in France is very different from Italy, and it's very different from. And I think leprosy was probably the same way, because you see, as you were saying, psoriasis or anything like that, that might routinely be called leprosy in one area and maybe not in another area.
Indeed.
Anyone?
Yeah.
I just wanted to know a bit more about your research process, and I know you put so much work into all of this, and like Joy mentioned, so many documents were destroyed, so I'd love to know a bit more about how you came to all these conclusions.
Sure, right. This is a kind of a combination of stuff that I spent about a year of my undergrad thinking about, and new research that I've done and read about St. Leonard's. So I started out with my old notes, actually, and a couple of very good secondary sources. If you wish to read an academic history of leprosy, the book is Leprosy in New England by Carol Wilford. I cannot recommend it enough. It is wonderful. Really. But I kind of started with the research that we have already at the museum, so Michael Laban, Ben Cox's work, and worked my way outwards. At the minute, I'm looking at trying to chase up a couple of citations and figure out when certain land transfers happened. But it was that kind of like, let's start here, let's check which sources they've looked at, let's see if we can find anything else. And that's been how it's gone.
Was there another question? Yes.
Anyone?
Teddy, thank you really. That was extremely interesting. That's one of the benefits of bringing together the sort of erudition that Teddy can bring to this with knowledge of the local history of people in the room. You come from St Leonard's farmhouse today. You've got experience as well, which is relevant. And together we can make this into such an interesting story of what happened in our town. And I'm really grateful to you. It's been extremely